Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We're currently in Module 2, and this lesson, we're going to cover loops, in this case, the for loop. Now, we covered the do-while loop, or the while loop, both of them, at the beginning before we started getting into the sets. And the reason why I went away from covering loops and went to the sets is because loops and sets work together really well. Because you have a set of data, and then you loop through it. And that's what we're going to do today in the for loop. So let's go over to Visual Studio and create a new project. We'll call this Console UI. And we'll say that this is Module 2, Lesson 10. The first thing we do is say console.readLine at the end. Now let's first see what a for loop looks like. Now as a snippet for this, remember a snippet is a shortcut. Okay, so if I type for, notice a little snippet icon is right there. I tab twice, and it sets up what is a little bit more complex of a snippet. So it says int I equals 0, I is less than length, I plus plus. So that's a little bit confusing at first, but the first thing I want to say, and I'll explain this whole thing. Let's start off with the basics. I is the counter. Normally, we'd say that I is a bad variable name because it imparts no knowledge as to what kind of data it holds or what it does. But this is a special case because with loops, especially for loops, we know that I is typically what's used. And this is kind of a custom from way back when with earlier programming languages, is that we use the single letter variable I for the counter. And so we're going to leave I as it is. We're not going to change the name. If you wanted to, you could, but we're not going to change the name. If I hit tab, it goes over to length. Now notice it says I equals 0. We're going to put length of 10 for right now. And I hit enter. And now I'm all set and it puts the cursor inside the for loop. So what's this going to do? Well, it starts off by initializing the counter. In this case, I. So it says int, which that's the number. It's a whole number. That's what we want. Int I, and the initial value is 0. So I starts off at 0. And then it says, when are you going to stop? You're going to stop once this is no longer true, once this is false. So keep going as long as I is less than 10. So is I less than 10 right now? Well, yes. I is at 0. It's going to say 0, 1, 2, 3. And how do we know that? Well, it says the last one. It says I plus plus. This is what gets called after we run through the for loop the first time. So you start off with I equals 0. We run the code inside these curly braces. When it gets to the bottom, it comes back to the top and says, okay, how do I move my counter forward? This last part tells it, I plus plus. And what plus plus means is add 1 to this number. So if it starts off at 0, the next number is 1. And then it does the evaluation. Is 1 less than 10? Yes. So run this code. Comes back to the top and says I plus plus. Well, 1 plus 1 is 2. Is 2 less than 10? Yes. Run this code. Comes back up and says 2 plus plus, or 2 plus 1, is 3. And it does it again until it gets to 9. And it says, okay, the value is 9. It checks 9 is less than 10. Yes. Runs this code, comes back up. 9 plus 1 is 10. Is 10 less than 10? No. Therefore, it does not run this code again. It goes below it. That's all there is to the for loop. Let's just show what we can do with this. Really simple. We can just say, let's just print out the number itself. That's all we're going to do. Print the number. So I. And that's it. If I hit start, it says 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. It has not hit 10. Now, we're counting at base 0. So if you look at this, there's 10 numbers here. So this right here tells us, when we say less than 10, really what we're saying is we want to do 10 numbers since we start at 0. So that's kind of a clue to you to say, okay, we're going to do 10 iterations through. Yes, this is a little confusing sometimes, and this is where you'll introduce some bugs. Because if you're not very, very careful with your numbering, then you might say, oh, I want to say less than 11 because I want 10 of them. Well, no, actually you want less than 10 because you start at item 0. So it's going to loop through from 0 to 9. That's all the for loop really does. Now you can tweak it if you want. You could say, well, I don't want base 0, I want base 1. And do it like that. No problem. That'll work. In fact, let's just demonstrate that. There you go, 1 to 10. But what's the problem with that? Well, the for loop goes with arrays really well. And arrays are base 0. So if you did this all the time, you'd miss the 0 element or the first element. So we want to leave it more as the default. So I is 0, and then whatever the number is you want to reach, that's what you would put here, so you go less than that. Now that's a basic for loop, and you can also, just so you know, you could do minus minus here, and then subtract 1. But here's the real problem you doing that. If I did this, I would crash my application. And the reason why is because I starts off at 0. The next time it comes through, I minus minus means that I is now -1. Is -1 less than 10? Absolutely. Then -2. Is -2 less than 10? Yep. And it will never not be anything but less than 10. So it's always going to be true that I is less than 10. Therefore, it's going to keep looping forever. An infinite loop. Again, loops are dangerous. Be very careful. So we count up. I++. You could also say I plus equals 2. Not 22, 2. And what that would do is it goes 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Let's just run this and show that yes, that does work. 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Because we're counting every other one. But notice that it stopped. And the reason why it stopped is because we said less than. We didn't say not equal to 10. Because if we did that, and I did by 3s, it would again be an infinite loop. Because it would skip over, it go 3, 6, 9, 12. And skip right over 10. So this is where this less than helps us out. Because it says, you know what? You always have to break once you go 10 or above. Therefore, it doesn't matter if it's, if it goes from 1 to 1,000, no problem. It's still going to break when you say 1,000. So you can mess with this stuff, but typically, this is the pattern. Now, just counting from 1 to 10, not very helpful. I mean, it's somewhat helpful, but not as helpful as if we had a list or an array. So let's use an array. I'll create a string array, and we're going to say this is first names equals, I'm going to initialize it right in line. So I'm going to say new string array, in my curly braces, and say Tim, Sue, Bob, and let's call that good. Now what I can do is I can create a for loop. So it's going to say 0, first name 0, which is Tim, then Sue, then Bob. Let's just see this. And there we go. Tim, Sue, Bob. So loop through all of them without us having to say how many elements are in this string array. I'm going to comment this out again, and we're going to do one more just to show you a little bit different. A list of string, call it last names, equals new list of string. And then last names dot add Corey Smith and Jones. Now we're going to do a for loop. I'll leave I alone. And the length is last names dot. If I try to do length, it's not there. The list of T is a little bit different. Instead of length, it's count. So it's a little bit different. But it still operates the same way. So now I can say console write line, last names, position I. Remember, the list of T still operates with that counter value, or that position value. And so you run this. Corey, Smith, and Jones. Now, I use short little ones for testing because of the fact I want to make sure that I'm getting my first one and my last one. So Corey, Smith, Jones, yep, I got all three. That just makes sure that I haven't done a counting error. For example, what if I put 1 here instead? And I run this, I get Smith and Jones. And you go, man, it's working right. But if you compare the lists, nope, I'm missing the first one. I've got Smith and Jones, but not Corey. So you make sure that is correct. Now, you wouldn't necessarily do this, but if for whatever reason you said, oh, I think it's -1 because we have a 0 base, that's not true because we have the less than. But if you did that, I've got Corey and Smith, but not Jones. So you know you're off. So you got to check to make sure that you're thinking correctly with your array. What I do sometimes if I'm using a for loop is I'll create a separate little project, a little console application, and just test out my logic to make sure I'm getting both the first element and the last one. Because if you get the first and the last, you know you got all the ones in the middle, as long as you're doing this plus plus and not something weird like plus equals 3 or something. And that brings us to our tip, which is to always check your numbering with the for loop. Always make sure that you're looking out for that. Because if you're not careful, you're going to miss either that first element or the last element. So always check that and make sure that you're getting all the ones you're supposed to. All right, homework time. Ask the user for a comma-separated list of first names. No spaces. So it's going to say, Tim, comma, Bob, comma, Sue, comma, Greg. So you're going to ask for that all in one shot. So they're going to give you this comma-separated list. Split that string into a string array. You've seen how to do that before. Then loop through that array and tell each person hello. So it's going to take some stuff you've learned before. We're going to add in the for loop and now see if you can't accomplish this in your homework. Give it a shot. If you can't get it, go back and watch the previous videos with a split or whatever else you're missing, or maybe this video, and until you can get it, make sure you got it. And then once you have it, then you can move on to the next lesson.